for a change, I didn't prepare a 20-page long slide presentation for anything, which is something I've been doing a lot these days. So instead, I just have a lot of stuff here that we can just access. I can share my screen with you as we go and read together some bits, or I have one of those web whiteboards just so we can draw some stuff if we need. But what I wanted to do is to begin by, let me just share my screen with you guys so we can look at it together. I wanted to begin by going to our website there, and the research directive, this sort of document that we produce, which is very short, just with some general overview of where we're planning to go with our research. And I think that this research directive already positions pretty much some of the issues that I ultimately want to get to, but puts them in context. So I think it's a good place to start. So I named the project, not very humbly, after Marx's own project. Marx has this famous book, one of the few that he actually published, called Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. And one of the things that this research that I'm involved in, one of the things that influences it is this work by this other Marxist called Alexander Bogdanov. And Bogdanov had a critique of Marx based on the use of labor as a primitive concept. And he has this theory where he says, well, isn't production and theory of labor actually specific cases of a more general theory of organization? So in a certain sense, the critique of political organization is a broader field of inquiry than the critique of political economy, even though organization is something we usually associate with smaller systems, right?
Can you make this full screen? It's very small to read.
Ah, really? Okay.
Okay, good.
I'm going to go through it with you guys anyway. So the basic definition is this idea. So first, so there is this little hint here that there is some shift in perspective that we want to take. And it's a paradoxical shift of perspective because organization, on one hand, points to a more localized notion, it seems. And on the other hand, it connects us back to an even broader field. So there's something a bit paradoxical in this shift. So the idea is this research project proposes to investigate the concept of organization from different standpoints, but with the ultimate aim of developing new tools to approach the field of collective organization in politics. The research could be divided into three main branches. The first is the critique of theoretical and practical role of organization in the history of political thinking. So this involves questions such as, how has political organization been conceived in the history of leftist political thinking? What falls within its scope and what does not under its different conceptions? So for example, if you open most books that supposedly deal with political organization, for example, I have a 4-volume compendium called Theory of Organization. And you say, okay, so I'm going to learn about organizing. What you find inside a book of leftist writings on organization is mostly texts that address an organization or that tell what this organization is going to do as a subject, in the sense that it is almost like an autonomous agency that is doing this, that is going to do that, it has this or that task, or all the things that by organizing we will be able to do. So organizing is usually treated as a verb that does things in the same way that swimming or walking, organizing. Whereas not so complicated look into the idea will quickly show that organization is a sort of weird action on top of actions, right? There is no such action as organizing. When you organize your book, you do a bunch of stuff It's not really like a particular activity. So a lot of things that are organizing fall outside this more substantive or more task-oriented view of organization. And a lot of things that are not organizing fall within it as well. So there are many ways to approach this, but we can discuss the limitations of certain conceptions of organization as the world changes, and you cannot really simply call organization the task of rallying up dissatisfied people into a protest or something. Second sort of question is how has the different formulations of the idea of organization in politics been affected by developments in arts and sciences in this time? So, for example, we find this interplay between theory of complex systems and Bogdanov's new vision of organization. A lot of more heterodox Marxists, when confronted with the fact that political organization in a certain vulgar Leninist sense was very restrictive, they looked into art as if it was the other side of that structure. So there is a sort of fetishism of artistic practice as creative organization, whereas political organization is more static and less creative, things like this. Or how have the historical changes in capitalism shifted the task of collective organization? Have they shifted it in meaningful ways? So, for example, what fell into the scope of political organization in a certain period of more, for example, more where you could count on the state for some level of welfare might be quite different from what you need to account in terms of your tasks as a political organizer or political organization, when certain conditions must be met, additional conditions must be met for previous actions to remain possible, right? So you perhaps you can no longer just concern yourself with what people do in their free time, because the moment that people have less free time, if you don't learn how to negotiate with their work time and their other constraints, you might not be able to accomplish much. So how have these changes affected what we need and how we think about organization? But so this is the first branch, is a sort of historical revision of the problem of organization within politics. The second is the evaluation of the theory of organization in the sciences. So is a look of how the issue of organization, the concept of organization appears within scientific practices and different ones. And there's a very long and complicated history of different approaches to this, right? From classical mechanics, which pretty much can do away with the idea, to thermodynamics, which introduces it pretty much as a way to think about the inverse measure of entropy, the question of morphodynamics, and so on, the problem of dynamic systems theory, complex systems, and how the whole systems approach very much seems to be the primary way to deal with the notion of organization, even though still not much about what organization, what it means to organize, or what is an organization is formalized in this approach. So transformation in modeling and experimental procedures for systems with non-simulatable models, the whole negentropy discussion in Schrödinger, the interplay between morpho and teleodynamics in Terence Deacon, the idea of self-organization in cybernetics, of attractors, and so on. The discussion concerning information and both the mathematical theory of information, the idea of computational irreducibility, the theory of surrogate reasoning, which is something has interesting me a lot. Rosen's discussion of state-based formal models as being essentially analogous to a mechanism, and a theory of models which have a lot of entailment but no state, no concept of states of a system, as more promising approach to think organization in biological systems and other places. So all of these different fields, they bring into play different aspects of this more broad or still in construction, this idea of organization. And I tend to take a preference for certain authors in this field against others, and I feel like I slowly starting to construct a similar way of approaching all of these thinkers, something that I want to get into in the future. And then the reconstruction out of this whole, let's say, this first decomposition of the concept as it's historically used, a revision of multiple directions that it was taken in the last year, especially with regards to science, and then a reconstruction of the concept with a more flexible and more robust approach that we can use it for other things. So what sort of regionalization strategy would allow us to move from the pure concept of organization as it's currently developed, especially in theoretical biology, to the specific context of political activity? So in which sense can we actually import something that is not totally out of context, and in which we can be informed by this without falling into improper conceptual loans? Second, how is this concept of reconstructed concept of organization to be posited with regards to the concept of labor? For example, is labor a form of organization or vice versa? And economy, right? What is the broadest form of structure or dynamic? The idea of organization or the idea of economy? Third, what does it mean to view a collective organization as an organ that senses information about scale irreducible social phenomena? So this is something I've been working on, especially Caron came in exactly at the moment that I'm describing something that I've been doing for 3 hours today already, which is trying exactly to approach in which sense collective practice of organization can function as a cognitive mapping of a social structure. Other questions involve also how can this new view of organization integrate ontological, epistemological, and aesthetic functions so that we can break the immediate link between politics and science and between politics and art? So how are these dimensions? So the sort of epistemological dimension, the idea that collective organization perturbs or intervenes in a social system in a way that can produce new information about it, right? What you would call measure the state. How can we think this sort of epistemological value of organization in purely political terms, in terms of a political thinking, rather than imbuing it with some pseudoscientific quality? Or how can we take seriously the sensible dimension of mediating between structure and our lived experience? That's something that organizations can help us to do, to see social phenomena as social phenomena without treating these as an aesthetics in the artistic sense sort of problem. Finally, something that builds on top of a lot of these ideas, how can we locate the experimental domain of politics with regards to collective organization? This is a particular question that has been interesting me a lot. I think I have a okay intuition as to what an artistic experiment is. I think I have an okay intuition as to what a scientific experiment is, even though the literature on scientific experimentation today is very much polemical, and a lot of stuff is being rethought. But still, I think we have a good idea of what we mean when we say a scientific experiment, an artistic experiment. Even, experimentation at the level of love, some people have an idea of what that might mean. But at the level of politics, it's not very obvious what experimental politics might mean. So in which sense can we include an experimental apparatus in politics? And again, how to do it in a way that it's not simply a pseudo-sociological, pseudo-scientific approach to this. So if experiments have a particular structure that connects certain activities to a way to interrogate something that we cannot measure in its full structure, how can we talk about this measuring as well in concrete political practice under contemporary conditions of a very complex capitalist system, a very complex local and global conditions, right? And finally, how does all of this help, from the view of all that we learn in this path, what should we keep and what should we abandon from the most common approaches to organization, right? So, to summarize, I would say that the whole idea is to point out and to clarify unnecessary restrictions or the poverty of a certain current concept of organization, to counterpose it to the richness of the discussion around what it means to organize, to be organized, the efficacy of organization with relation to what is organized and things like this, to counterpose the poverty of the political vision of organization to the richness of what is being thought in terms of organization everywhere, and then to return to the problem of political organization with a more flexible, more complicated, more interesting idea of what this might mean for politics, right? So today, my idea was not to go into any of this, even though not most of this, at least. Of course, this is a very long research project. What I could say before I go into the topic that I thought we could start exploring, even though the connection between the two is perhaps not so obvious. What I thought I can say before going to it is that I think I was led in a certain way to this line of inquiry by an intermediary step, because I began my research, I don't know, like 12 years ago, in this book that I co-wrote with Dennis. My master's thesis was about how Hegel's theory of spirit is in a paradoxical relation to some of the concepts that psychoanalysis puts forward. Lacan poses this theory of the death drive as this thing that has a sort of particular ambiguity as to how it relates to negativity, right? You somehow experience in analysis, and most people come to analysis because of this, situations in which you don't recognize yourself, where you do things that you don't feel like you are in control of them. They go on their own. And the whole gist of psychoanalysis is to suspend the, let's say, perhaps moral judgment that everything that disrupts you in this way is necessarily something to be avoided. So it allows this rupture to have an ambivalent status, because at the same time that it's something that perturbs your identity, it very well might be something that takes your desire a bit further than you are aware of, right? So there's an ambiguity or an ambivalence to the value of the things that become somewhat autonomous from ourselves. It might be the thing that betrays who you are, but it also might be the place where you are yourself the most. So I was interested in the fact that Hegel's theory of spirit has this same structure in its basic formulation, even though, I mean, this is Zizek's thesis, right? Lacan, when he was being most Lacanian and most concerned with psychoanalysis, pure psychoanalysis, nothing but psychoanalysis, he was pretty much rediscovering a bunch of Hegelian theses. But Hegel's thesis doesn't have one prerogative that Lacan's thesis had. Because for Lacan, one of the properties of the death drive is that it is asocial, meaning this process functions so as to remove you from identifications. Identifications are on the social side, the death drive is on the asocial side. Whereas in the theory of spirit, you get whole populations for Hegel trying to get into some sort of stability by proposing laws. Then these laws start doing things that they didn't plan, and the whole society comes crumbling down. So you get that same sort of strange negative effect emerging from within something that was supposedly intrinsic to some sort of self-recognition. And Hegel keeps the ambiguity because sometimes, as he says, a book written on the war of Peloponnesius is more important than the war in Peloponnesius. The war happened so that the book could happen. So sometimes the struggle for him comes out of it something that is the truth goes through that negativity, but on the other hand, it can ruin everything and so on. So spirit moves through, tarries with the negative, right? The death drive tarries with the negative, but the death drive has an additional property, which is you cannot construct with it. You can only remove, subtract from construction. So I was interested in Zizek's thesis that Lacan was Hegelian when he was moving beyond the theory of recognition and towards the theory of the drive. But I thought that there was a small contradiction there, because Lacan does not accept this variability that Hegel accepts. That, well, not only is there is this thing that tarries with negativity and that in disruption ends up doing stuff, but this can be conflictive with sociality, but in other places it might not. And I realized that both psychoanalysis and Marxism has a similar position with regards to this. Both reject the same aspect of Hegel's theory of spirit. Marxism keeps a lot of Hegelianism, but whereas it accepts that capitalism is always mutating and remaining the same somehow, Marxist organizations are totally obsessed with making sure that what they do is what they planned and things don't get out of control. So you have absolutely no ambivalence as to the value of forms that autonomize themselves over those who created them. So a theory of labor based on this is a theory where labor is an expressive exteriorization, and capitalism is the one that estranges us from the results of labor. A theory of political organization based on this is a theory where our theoretical principles are applied in practice, and we judge practice by the righteous verification that those theories were properly applied. We have absolutely no terms in political language of Marxism to talk about organizations that move in a direction that we didn't expect them to. That is not a pejorative term. So every time an organization does something we didn't expect it to do, we automatically suppose somebody directed that process. It benefits somebody. Usually that's when organizations split into groups that are smaller, go back to a sort of critical mass that still doesn't suffer this emergent effects, right? And I realized that there is a sort of, I was mentioning this in class today, there is a sort of division in the history of organization where those who, let's say, follow the momentum from Hobbes to Smith, to Adam Smith, those who think from their liberal tradition forward, they usually privilege complexity over responsibility, in the sense that social organization is foremost a complex issue of complexity. It has emergent properties, it has stability points. Our task, our responsibility is to deal with that fact. So responsibility, social responsibility, justice, equality are always, let's say, best put under the prevalence of complexity or social complexity. Whereas which makes sense, because let's say the transition from Hobbes to Adam Smith is a transition of the idea of sovereignty between people to a sovereignty between things. If you want to see the whole, if you want to understand the hand that moves things, no longer look at the monarch, but look at the market itself. Sorry, guys, just give me 1 second. Just need to get to the door here. Just a second. Sorry, I just ordered some food. It's arriving. I need to open the door in a second. But just to close the thought, that I know it was in the middle of it. So you get a certain tradition which wages that the critique of sovereignty, absolutist, monarch, state-based sovereignty, is a move towards the relations between things, the relations between consumers, the relations between producers. And you can only look, you don't need to look at the whole, you can only look at yourself, and the whole will produce its own properties. And the tradition that criticizes Hobbes, not by moving from states of serenity to things, but from the one monarch to the multiple, is the Rousseau tradition, right? We place responsibility over complexity. So rather than define responsibility based on letting complexity run loose, we define complexity and the degrees of complexity based on the constraints of responsibility we want to take over a social system. So participation, autonomy, self-determination are the main concepts, and how complex society needs to be to adequate itself to this comes second. So generally, the tradition that follows this is more the socialist one, and the one that privileges complexity over the capacity to think of ourselves as the causes of the social effects, right? To be able to conceive of ourselves as participation in the decision of over the destiny of a social formation. The one that privileges complexities is more focused on the liberal tradition. Now, we end up in the situation where socialists don't have, as I said, a name, a non-pejorative name for the moment that the organizations tend to move beyond the responsible parameters we set for ourselves. So ossification, bureaucratization, the emergence of a totalitarian leader, or it has detached itself from the basis, it has deviated from theory, proposed a revisionist position. All changes in that sense are somehow negative, and we don't even have a term for this way of picking up movement and autonomizing itself from those it organized. That is a positive name. I remember I was seeing that movie on Facebook, a Social Network, and I remember I was so melancholic because there is a scene right at the beginning where the Zuckerberg character, he created like the first prototype of Facebook, and his Brazilian friend says, we need to monetize this, we need to do something with this. This is a system for doing X, Y, and Z. I don't remember what he said. And Zuckerberg answered, just calm down, we don't know what this is yet. And I was so melancholic that this is an experience we simply cannot have on the left today. We simply never are in a position to say we don't know what this is yet. If you don't know what this is, you're missing something. It's not a state that you need to negotiate with and learn something new by the unwanted effects of what you began doing, right? Just grab my hamburger just a second. Sorry, guys, I just had a long talk with the guy with bringing the handbook. So anyway, so the idea is that I saw that there was this strange asymmetry, both how there was a sort of imperative aspect in psychoanalysis to a sort of presupposition that the death drive has this asocial characteristic, simply because in most cases it comes to contradict the identity of the subject in the way that it functions and so on. And on the Marxist side, that there was always this aspect of sociality, that social forms could never autonomize themselves from the principles from which they were created without coming to contradiction with the very reason of being, right? So it felt to me like there was something in Hegel's theory of spirit that had to be further developed in a way that could be properly implemented into these two fields. I've been developing this idea in psychoanalysis for a long time now. I just finished with the book I just handed in, at least finished proposing it. Evidently, it's not like philosophy is going to teach anything to psychoanalysis, but it can remove constraints that are artificial. And that idea was one of the constraints that I tried to challenge. And the same is now a project that I'm trying to do with political organization and Marxism conceived as a political practice, not just as a theory. I don't need a theory of why organizations autonomize themselves or things don't go the way we plan and so on. Though I think that's important, what I'm most focusing on is coming up with practical a practical approach to this, so that we can actually deal with it and follow these movements in a way that are more manageable, and we can do things with this. And I mean, human resources, management theory, organizational design, all these fields that were developed outside of a political context, they very much are, if you read the bibliography today, for all their ideological presuppositions here and there, they still are the most advanced attempts to think this sort of thing. So I'm interested in what can we do with these ideas when we don't have those particular constraints and we want to experiment with this. So this is how I got to this whole project. I'm simplifying it a lot here, but it still goes pretty much in that direction. And what I thought we could do in the time that we have left together was to, I mean, I didn't really didn't get to prepare something very detailed on this. So what I thought of doing was to take one of these questions here, this two, in fact. How can we move towards the idea of organization, knowing that we have all this debate with other areas, right? Caron's presentation last time dealt with the problem of organization, systematicity, normativity, and all of those things within the context of art. We want to be in dialogue with all of this, but at the same time, we want something that somehow allows us to talk about a more intrinsic view of political practice. And so that's why I say we want to be able to talk about let's say the structure of political organization, and we know that it has, looking at other fields, clarifies this a lot, but we want to sever the ties with science every time so that we don't need to speak of science in order to speak of political thinking. And we want to be able to sever the ties with arts as if it's the only way to talk about creativity in political action. So by severing these ties and recuperating these ideas so that they are reconstructed from within a political approach, we don't need to import a lot of other presuppositions that sometimes come together when you try, for example, to bridge political thinking with scientific thinking and things like this. But this is a very complicated network to navigate, because evidently it's not a matter of coming up with a sort of restricted division of fields, disciplines that don't have anything to do with each other. We should do a sort of vulgar Althusserian cleaning of the slate of improper importations, because each field has its object, and science is defined by some object, politics is defined by some object, because that's not exactly true, and it's also very restrictive, and the empirical reality doesn't really help us to start from that direction when we're constantly actually moving between different procedures and things and so on. So how can we construct a view of politics where it has some autonomy without treating politics as a sort of closed space, right? I think that, I mean, Reza did a lot of work on this, though I think that he arrived at the definition of interiority, the idea of discipline, without moving, let's say, from the mud out, but from a more clear skies down, right? So it already comes with a lot of definition, whereas recognizing this sort of autonomy within situations in a situated way is sometimes more complicated. The research itself that I'm doing is already so entangled in so many things that evidently things are not pure. So even if you can bring into the picture some level of separation, insofar as we do use the word politics to describe something that's distinct from something else, right? This was Hegel's argument when in his text on Reason in History, he talks about how he moves beyond the idea that there is no actual history, there's only narratives about the past. He says, sure, there's only narratives about the past that are fiction in some way, but in them being fiction, they say we cannot do a history of facts, but we can do the history of fictions about the facts. That's an actual history that exists. Not only that, but we actually tend to name these fictions for some reason with big names like politics, the history of art, the history of politics, the history of this, the history of that. And in that sense, because there is a class of fictions that share a similar property, therefore there is a history of a similar property that is a universal. So there is something, if we mean something by art at a certain point, there is a reason why it appears in that kind of cohesive sense, even though it's always tense, historically changing, and so on. So even though politics involves the same material that other things do, and artists are buying their material, they charge for their work, they live off of it, they're dealing with material that has social political implications, still somehow people do art and not politics when they mess with these things. So how can we start? So my idea today was, given that we want to come up, for example, as with the question E, a view of experimentation that is intrinsic to politics. So given that we want to have the politics as having a referent that refers to certain things and not to others, and that while recognizing that we might be talking about a field that is can you guys see this? Is this too small on the screen?
I can see it.
Okay. No, just so I know if I can draw here and if it works. So just to make like just a play on this, let me see if I can make this. It's like, okay, we have some material here. And it's true that politics does this and brings it into this regime. Other fields use the same material and bring it this way. So nobody's denying the reality that things are shared in some sense, but we want to superimpose into this view that somehow the material that can be activated by an artistic procedure is shared by many other procedures, right? For example, you can use geometric perspective in perspective painting, but it also is a theorem by Desargues that concerns the projective plane and gives rise to topology. Of course, there's something that's shared there, but we want to be able to understand what are these vectors here, and in which sense this material, how is perhaps the organization of this material different in this case, and this case, that when we see a painting by Brunelleschi there and the way that he uses perspective, we know that it's something that is inscribing itself in the history of art and not really in the history of science. Why is it here and not here? Even though it shares so much with projective geometry and so on and so forth, right? So we want to be able to navigate this and not really, neither accept the thesis that everything is separate, nor accept the thesis that everything is the same, but we want to be able to navigate when one thing is inscribed in one place and when it's inscribed on the other. So for example, we can take, I don't know, some melody there, like the International, and you can simultaneously inscribe it in the International has a place in, for example, the Paris Commune. Sorry, I'm trying to write here. I'm loving this. Which will make you analyze, for example, to discuss the political implication of the International, the Potier song, in terms of its melodic structure, things like this. It's possible. It might produce interesting things. For example, there is that famous analysis of the American anthem as being an unpopular song in its very structure because it includes notes in a register that most people cannot sing. So the lowest and the highest note in the main melody of the American anthem is very hard to sing. Therefore, you need to be specialized. Therefore, it's unpopular. But okay, you can make that argument, but you're not really analyzing very much of the musical structure when you're doing that. So you kind of inscribe the song of the International in a certain history. If you want to analyze it, kind of bring to the fore what's political about it. For example, you will consider if it was easy to sing, if it, God, I shouldn't even try to write here, I'm sorry. If it perhaps tapped into the sort of thing that most people were into singing at that moment, if it was presented at the right moment with the right people present, what was it able to do in terms of mobilizing people? Why is it sung in so many languages and things like this? So you want to it's the same material and it contains the musical form, but it's being put in the service of something else, being that which sees it. It's seen from a particular perspective, right? But the same song can be analyzed artistically if you want, and you can discuss if it continues the tradition of this or that style and use of whatever musical structure it presents. When you do this and compare it to totally stupid music tradition that has no amazing communist vocation, and you put it in line with those other things, and you compare it in that context, or you analyze it musically and compare it with something else, I don't know, you're not really doing political analysis. You're inscribing the same material, which also includes and was partially decided upon based on political concerns, but you're now including it into a different form of analysis. So you can have I wanted to be able to have that distinction, and my way of approaching it very simply, I think, would be to call this thing here, which it shouldn't be a music connotation, but it's just this undefined multiplicity here. So my current approach to this, very basic, this is where I wanted to start talking to you about, is to have this multiple here, I don't want to define much about it. And I will call it very generally the matter. And the thing is that this matter can be formed in a way that highlights something political about it, some similar something artistic. At the same time, you can analyze, I don't know, you can move to some discussion on relation between instrumentation and the sound it produces, and analyze frequencies and things like this, and can perhaps concern yourself with something scientific. You can talk about a feeling of, I don't know how you want to do an emotional analysis of it with love and God knows what. Anyway, the idea is that for now, I don't want to commit to any sort of class of points of view or forms, whatever you want to call this. But this is just a very broad way for us to approach how a same thing can be inscribed, or if you want, counted as one, as Badiou would put it, into situations that privilege different aspects of it, right? So I'm trying to very broadly here take an approach where something is formed into a political situation. It can be this same multiple in all of these different situations here. Political situation, artistic situation, scientific situation, and so on. And the reason why I think that this is an okay distinction is that when it's not a bad way to deal with what Badiou calls a site within a situation, precisely in terms of a form of indistinct multiple that begets some form to the situation, right? So, for example, you have a political situation. Within it, you get. Let me see how do I erase this whole page at once? New bar. So, for example, Badiou will give this classic structure, classic example. You have a situation that's, for example, the situation of workers in a factory in some place, sometime. After all, it's a situated context, right? For example, you can have from everything that is supposed to exist here, from managers, workers, machines, so on and so forth. We know that when you enter a factory, you are counted as a commodity, not because people hate you or anything, but because the logic of production is the logic of commodity production. How efforts are going to be deployed, where they're going to be deployed, everything is based on how you're going to negotiate with the extraction of surplus value and collateral effects, so on and so forth. Okay, so one thing that happens is that even though everything works in terms of commodities, and you can, for example, if you have a machine here that has some value, you can talk about the parts of the machine as having value. You can go into the parts of this set called machine and know the value of its spare parts, things like this. You can analyze everything in those terms. But when you get to the worker, for example, the worker counts as a worker, but what's within the worker is not included in the situation. So, for example, a situation includes a machine and the parts of the machine, but it includes the worker and doesn't include what is included in the worker, right? What belongs to the worker. So, where he's from, language that he speaks, a lot of particularities here are totally abstracted from when you count everything as one in this sense. The workers that sort of reduce what's called the labor force. So, for example, let's say that a worker in this side of the factory, in terms of being a worker, he's totally problematic and has serious working competition, for example, with another factory worker or another set of factory workers. But the fact is that if you look at what these structures are counting, the women who are not in the factory, they are all concerned that their husbands will be fired. Even though they're competing here and they cannot be organized here, these can be organized, for example. This happened in the state of Vitória in Brazil a couple of years ago, where police officers could not rebel against other police officers because this is against the law. So the women organized a protest and they did a strike in front of the police station. So their husbands couldn't be fired because they weren't really going against their jobs, because military police in Brazil is not allowed to do strikes. But they found a way around it precisely because there was something not formed by the situation that could be forced into the situation in order to organize it in a way that's different. So this idea that there is some sort of indistinct, let's say, matter, very broadly speaking, that can inform a situation. This idea is not very distinct from, I mean, in my understanding of what Caron presented last time as a sort of normative view of the indeterminate in Cage's work, where rather than assuming that we moved from, let's say, tonality system and normative approach to music, even to atonal music and so on and so forth, towards an indeterminate outside, the way that he presented it very much resonated with me, with the idea that, well, there is something that seemed indistinct about silence, but you, for example, can use it to propose a different normative system for a different sort of experimental situation in music. So it wasn't very much about negating forms in favor of the indeterminate, but that there was something that could inform normative procedures because you go into something that is supposedly indistinct and you tap into it and bring it into play with other parts of music. So there is a sort of broadening of the space. So in this way that I proposed here, this first distinction between some multiple that is, we don't really know anything about it. It's almost an heuristic approach. And we can talk about some level of forming that brings it into different fields, even though they're all tapping into the same thing. And it's not because there is no form here. We simply don't know how to limit how we would talk about it. This gives rise to situations. And the fact that within a political situation, we do have the same distinction between sites, which are, as Badiou says, at the edge of the void, in the sense that there are no resources in the situation to distribute and classify what is inside of them, but this is a relative property of that situation. It's not because there is something unfathomable in here, but there are things in a situation that cannot be counted by it if it is an empirical situation. And forcing and reorganization and fidelity and event are all operations to allow us to describe how we could force something indiscernible into the organization principle of a situation, so that we can now not simply tie things organize things the way that they were organized previously. So it's not true that in an event we introduce an ex nihilo principle of organization into a situation for Badiou, so much as with the ex nihilo hypothesis, we can use the site to inform the situation in a perspective that we could not from other without that hypothesis, right?
I have a question of understanding. Can you clarify the term site exactly? What is the site?
Yeah, there is the formal definition. You just need to get that. So you need to start with that distinction between set and subset, right? For example, you have a set that has X and Y. You have here a subset which has, for example, X, Y, and so on. Meaning I took this and I was able to separate the parts of it, right? Okay, for Badiou, a site, which is something that he uses to distinguish between natural and historical. So, for example, I think that he has this distinction. I don't remember very well how it goes, but natural situations are ones where everything that is in a set, so everything that is the elements of a set here, are themselves sets in the situation. E1, E2, E3. So, for example, you have this transitivity structure where something that is presented is then represented in as well, and you have the representation of that. And then he calls historical situations the ones that will have the structure that include at least one site. What is a site? Oh God, my God, I'm writing too much on this. I'm having too much fun and it's not really being helpful. A site is a multiple where, for example, in the example that I gave, you have a worker is contained in the situation. For example, a unit of production contains, for example, the machine, the worker that operates it. But things that are contained under the worker are not part of the situation, are not elements of the situation, right? So you have a set with something inside of it, and nothing that is inside the set is also part of the situation. Just the set with the elements inside of them, right? Am I simplifying too much? If anyone wants to clarify what I'm saying a bit more.
I don't know if it helps. In set theory, there is an axiom that all sets have subsets, or at least a subset, that shares nothing with the set that it belongs to. Now, if there are two possibilities here. If the set that does not share any element with its parent set is the empty set, they call that set a natural set.
Exactly.
If in another possibility is if there is a set that has an element, and that element, which is a set itself, does not share at least one element with the parent set, then that's called a historical situation or historical subset. So a site is a subset, an element of a bigger set. If you have a set A, it has many different elements. A site is one of those elements that have elements within it which don't appear in the parent set.
Okay, thank you. I think that's clear enough.
Right. So the idea is that, but you will talk about it contains something that is unpresented in the situation. To be presented is to belong. To be represented is to be a part, right? In the sense to be included. And the problem is that you have some, that's why it's at the edge of the void, because this thing here, which is part of is a subset of every set, right? Which is the void set. It's when you have some actual elements, for example, under the set that he mentioned, right? You have a set A, it has elements, and one of those elements has elements, for example, W and some P's, I don't know. And none of these are within the subsets of A. The subsets of A include X, include XY, includes XYZ, and so on and so forth.
Hey, Gabriel, we lost your video.
Not really.
Or I lost your video. Okay, now I got it.
See it. Yeah.
Yeah, but the idea is simply, you see, like these elements here, they work pretty much, they let's say incarnate something, a property that generally is a property of the void. So but I think that in more, let's say, no theoretical, set theoretical lingo, the point is that he calls a historical situation a situation in which matter and form, if you take form to be the rules that count for one things in a situation, and matter, what is the multiples being counted, where this informing is not complete. There is something here that is not counted in the situation. And but you as a materialist, this is not indeterminate, totally, absolutely indistinct, etc., etc. This is filled with structure. We just don't know what it is. In set theory, in axiomatic set theory, no, there is no structure. We just have an inconsistent multiplicity. We have count as one, and so on and so forth. But that's for ontology. But for actual situations, you have a material that is being formed into that situation, and something of it is not important or not counted or whatever. And the point is, if you have a situation based on this form and the space of what can be done with that form, what he calls the state of the situation, right? This is the situation, the space and what is formed in it. You can have an extra hypothesis that allows you to tap into this material and propose a different way of forming things here that doesn't necessarily produce things that are within that space. Just redo this. Right? This other way of forming things might not really fall into the space of possibilities that you already had for what can vary within that form. So in that sense, let's say I'm trying to take this intuitive approach that Badiou already poses as a situated approach within a already determined sphere. So if you already call the situation political, you can have this distinction between, let's say, this multiple and the way that things are counted here as form. So my question is, can I use this, extrapolate this into this broader distinction where I have, again, a multiple and a matter and somehow sort of archy form that distinguishes politics, art, and so on. So this is, I don't think this is going to be settled this easily. But at the same time, this approach, I think it has already some merits, which is we don't need to presuppose that what's here is distinct. For example, that classic Laocoonte-Lessing, this idea that art, all that it does is to unfold the forms that are intrinsic in the material. So poetry has its object, which is language, and visual arts have their object, which is we don't need to presuppose that just because forms capture things in different ways, that whatever it is that they are capturing is by definition distinct in some ontological sense. On the contrary, we're saying that there is something here that can be inscribed into these regimes in very different ways. But once they are inscribed there, even though we can shift perspectives again, once they are inscribed, somehow they come into what becomes relevant is a particular aspect of them rather than another. That doesn't mean that we always have to look at the same aspect. It might be the case that some artistic practice uses the fact that the international is evidently a political song to some artistic use, like a movie can do this, right? Put it into the context of a drama and so on, and many people on the streets, the song is playing, and the lovers want to meet, I don't know. But still, something is the place from which you are forming that content is inscribed into some thinking that we call art, right? Whatever it is that We don't need to define the limits of it or anything like this. So this is one of the ways I've been approaching this, though I haven't had much luck or time to develop it further. But it's important for me because this basic idea that we want to develop here, where, well, a site in a procedure, plus a certain very broad idea of an event that we are rather defining as more of as a hypothesis that is not motivated than as some sort of amazing religious experience that comes ex nihilo, but it's just the addition of an ordinary, unmotivated, unprovable, undecidable statement. These two things here, they lead us to something which has something like a new form, but also something that has some experimental dimension. Because
when you say a new form, do you mean a new form of the same form? I mean, at your diagram, the forms are like politics and art. So if you harvest a site that then becomes an event because it's not counted as one in the situation, if I'm correct in the Badiouian jargon. So this will give rise to a new form, you say. This new form is still political, or this new form is something that we don't know what it is?
No, it would be political.
So the political cannot be the form, it seems to me.
Yeah, that's why, I mean, this new form here concerns this arrow here.
Okay.
The political.
So this new form will be inside the political, but previously you define the different different fields like politics, science, and art as forms. So is it a form within a form? Are you using, just to be clear, are you using the same nomenclature? Form is like a generic I don't know, category or something, so you can have a category inside a category or something like that?
No,
or,
I think that
our forms, I mean, the truth procedures like politics, art, science, and love. These are the forms, or something like that. Because
I think that,
if you say those are the forms, if you create a new form, so it's not politics anymore, it's not art anymore, it's just this new form. Are they in the same level, or are they like one embedded in the other?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I used form here first just to make the distinction very crudely between matter and form.
Okay.
So it was in that concept of a classic.
Yeah, I understood. But yeah. So it's not, you're not using technically, you're not sticking with it.
No, I'm not sticking with it. I would say that when we talk about forms, ideas, we are within a procedure for Badiou, and the name of this bigger arrow that moved from the matter to some perspective on it, seeing it as something like this, which is a broader approach, or it's not really the creation of a form. That's where thinking happens. So the political thinking exists because you can see material as containing things, forms, structures, and so on, that play a tap or enter into dialogue with political structures. So there is something called political thinking. We have tried to call this, Reza's book goes very deep into this, something like a discipline, which is not a field. There is no boundary here. So you see, this is the boundary of a situation. It's not the boundary of politics, right? Actually, if I were to do this correctly, I mean, we would have to have these distinctions here. We would have to have this first thing, we don't know what it is, and it gives rise to, for example, political thinking. Within political thinking, we have infinite amount of situations. that may or may not have that structure. So it's not like we come into one situation. And within these situations is that the idea of form that makes more technical sense.
Yeah.
So there are actually 3 levels here, because we need to talk about this first arrow here. What does this mean?
So you have an indeterminate level, and then the thinking level,
Mm-hmm.
level of the thought, and then the level of the forms.
Yeah, I would say we have this level of the thinking that already is complicated, because how do we define this boundary?
Yeah, I was going to ask you this. This is the problem.
First question. And then within this, okay, we have this aspect here, which concerns, I think, the way Badiou would call it, is not even a form, but there are ideas.
Ideas, okay.
Right, I have an idea is pretty much a good way of saying, there's more to this than what has been counted.
The idea is the green arrow, right? The idea are not the situations. The idea is the green arrow.
Yeah, it's the green arrow. Yeah.
Is the presence of a site within the situation. This is the idea.
An idea is an operation with that site, right?
Okay.
So one thing that I realized, and this is, let's say, just my final point, which is also very, very unorthodox, but is one approach to this. Definitely not something you find in Badiou, but I'm trying to develop it in this direction. So this allows us to say, okay, I grant you that you created a contextualized theory of situations with ideas where you can actually account for some level of experimentation only with that reorganizes a situation only with the resources of the situation. All of this is pretty much included in this level here. But most people don't buy this division here, the red things, because Badiou doesn't give us a theory of this. He sometimes just says it's like Spinoza, there are possibly infinite attributes, but we just know 2.
Yeah.
There are possibly infinite procedures, but we only know 4. So Zizek will say, why isn't religion a procedure? Things like this. So I have a 2-part theory. One part is philosophical, one part is very Marxist, as to why there are procedures. So just wanted to conclude with this. The first part is philosophical, and it doesn't explain why there are 4, but I can explain why there cannot be 1. Why there must be more than multiple procedures. And this idea is based on the distinction between ideals and ideas. So let's say let's think ideals in terms of criteria that reproduce what we already know. So they inscribe what we don't know in what we already know. For example, in that distinction, we would say the already known form encompasses the matter that we don't know. The uninformed is formed by what we know. Ideas privilege the inverse path. They take the matter and it helps us to reinvent something about the form. Something like this. So it pushes form in a direction that it hasn't gone yet. We move towards the limit of something we know, right? So this here pushes things into the known. This pushes the known into the unknown, something like this. When we have an idea, sometimes we don't even know exactly what we are thinking. We just know that you just get to this direction, things might go nicely. It's more open in that way. So my point is that you can imagine, for example, that there are no ideas, only ideals. A classic position in, for example, analytic analysis of group formations. Groups always will move to take everyone's differences and identify everyone together. They're only ideals. Now, let's say that, again, this is a wager. You say, no, there are ideas, meaning you can learn something new by doing a certain, you prove, let's say that you can move towards an unknown area, right? Now, let's say you did this. An idea broke with an ideal. For example, Russians, Marxists thought revolution could only happen in a capitalist advanced place. Lenin had an idea, and Leninism was an idea about revolution in a place where capitalist formation was not fully consistent and advanced yet. Now, if you have only, first thing is, if there is only one idea, for example, now, so this is Lenin apropos of Marx. Marx became an ideal for people, Lenin went and had an idea. Now, in Brazil, in 2019, people think we need to do Lenin again. So you take the same idea, as if there's one idea, and you try to apply it again. Now it's no longer an idea, it's an ideal.
Okay.
Because you're taking now the situation that is totally new and you're trying to apply it again. So if an idea is to happen only once, there are no ideas, because it is already an ideal. Just because any second time it happens, you already are reproducing, it falls under this side, right? So now you have Leninism as an ideal, and we're over. So if we don't have anything else here to break with that, or anything that's not really, that is gonna learn from the situation and change our form of doing things again, if there were ideas, that doesn't mean that it will ever be again, in that sense. And secondly, let's say that you accept that politics is a field where ideas appear, meaning there's always some new thing here that can emerge out of the concrete conjuncture and break with the modes of reproduction and so on and so forth. You might still defend the thesis that all ideas are political. Well, if you do this, this means that you'll take politics as a measure of creativity, innovation, and so on for other fields. For example, for art. And in that sense, again, you took an idea and you turn it into an ideal. It was an idea politically, but for art, it's now an ideal because you're importing something political, a form, and it's gonna, even though it's a form that is innovative for politics, it's gonna impose something on an artistic material, right? This is, for example, what you call the didactic principle in art. Put art in the service of something, right? So again, the idea falls into an ideal here as well. Ideas fall into an ideal. So if you don't have, you're obliged, if you want to keep a theory of ideas, to maintain diachronically that more than one idea exists. Otherwise, ideas become ideals. So there must be more ideas in time, because if only one rupture happens, for example, Christ divides the history in two, everything new that happens is the re-experience of the Christian event. It can be an event in some religious sense, but it cannot be an event in the sense of producing something historically new. But it also needs to have a synchronous multiplicity, because if only one field is capable of novelty in this sense, for example, scientific method is the only method that can allow us to have novelty that is not postulated on prejudice and intuition and so on and so forth. If you maintain that only for one procedure, you are already having ideas functioning as ideals again, because what functions for science as a particular idea in a particular time will function as an ideal when you start having art follow some weird idea of scientific or whatever it is, or politics must be scientific in whatever sense. So in synchronous terms as well, you need to have more than one types, or whatever you want to call, of ideas. So if we define ideas in this way, the only way that we can have a consistent theory of this, where this is not just a moment of the birth of a new ideal, is if we accept that there must be more ideas in time and more types of ideas next to each other. Otherwise, talking about ideas is still just kind of a posh way of talking about something we don't understand yet, but it's pretty much going to become a criteria for judging other things that have nothing to do with it. So this is the first approach I have to the problem, which is ideas must be multiple. Otherwise, they contradict what ideas are. But it's that sort of approach that sounds like a trick, and I'm not sure it's very consistent the way that I think about it. But anyway, it's my first attempt. My second attempt is more crazy, and it follows from one idea that I had, which is, sorry, I'm eating a hamburger. The following. I realized that up until Hegel, but Marx still, Hegel, Feuerbach, and Marx, they share the idea that spirit, it might appear in multiple ways, but somehow it refers, if it refers back to the absolute, it refers always to one thing. Meaning there is some level of unity between the figures of the generic. Right? So for example, Marx will talk about, so Hegel has one spirit, so you cannot have the logic of spirit developing in a path that can never be reintroduced back into the general gist of spirit. So for me, for example, this is one of the underlying problems that he has with mathematics in the science of logic, because from within the Hegelian discourse emerges a moment, which is the moment of differential calculus, the beginnings of formalization of the infinite, and so on, that you could intuit that it's plastic enough to think its own development as a sort of branch out of spirit that is never going to come back to it. It's just becoming autonomous, like a weird spurt of formalism. And this is not thinkable within the approach that everything that is produced by a movement of autonomization, of course, is not going to be reintegrated back into the Hegelian system in a sort of perfect harmony. Hegel would never about that. But at the same time, it referred to a common background somehow. And Feuerbach has this too when he talks about generic being. So you move from spirit to this idea of species, where Marx gets this idea of generic being, right, which is very much species being as well, as a sort of some level of unity, meaning, for example, it can express itself as the way we politically participate in the destiny of our society. But when he also says, well, the proof of the generic is that we can produce things not only according to necessity, but according to the laws of beauty. These laws are not motivated by anything direct, so they also relate to some other level, and so on and so forth. But all of this somehow attests to this common potency. Now, he dropped this theory, right? Because the theory of generic being had one main goal, one main function in his system. In my opinion, it has two functions, but the main theoretical function was to explain two things. People, when they labor through work, right? We produce something here. A particular laborer produces a work. Another worker produces a different work. And he needs to explain the relation between these workers. And one of the ways that he did this is saying, look, when I produce something new, for example, I'm the first person to come up with a bicycle. If I came up with a bicycle, this product says something about the capacity of everyone. Because the very novelty of what I produced says something about what humans can do. So the first function of the generic was to propose a social connection with social theory of labor. And second, it also explained labor as an indistinct capacity. It's not that there is the labor of the shoemaker, the labor of the pin maker, of the person who knits or whatever. There is this generic indistinct capacity that expresses itself in all these things. So it also had the theory of indistinct potency. But what happened was that when Marx wrote Capital, the social theory of labor, where it is the generic that binds workers, was substituted for the theory of labor commodity. There's absolutely nothing ontological connecting laborers together, but the fact that they're selling their labors as commodities. Commodities are related through exchange. Therefore, this relates laborers through the products of labor. So what was previously generic and beautiful about humanity getting in contact, this homogenizing principle behind the estrangement of products, is substituted for the theory of commodification of labor. It's because labor is sold and things sold in the market are connected to prices that labors are connected amongst each other. And second, Marx criticized the theory of indistinct potency as a sort of ontological capacity. People are indistinct in this potency and so on, for the theory of abstract labor. So these two elements are substituted for two aspects of the theory of value. So he gives up on this theory. He doesn't need the idea that we have a common generic capacity that is hidden here behind, expressing itself through work. And when we produce something new, this generic capacity is attested in all of us, in whatever form this has been produced. So Marx's theory was a theory of the one generic potency. And he himself was, let's say, limited by, so we have these theories presented in the economical philosophical manuscripts, so 44. Then Capital comes in 67, and we no longer need the generic to explain social homogenization of labor and indistinct quality of labor. Those two things are substituted by value theory. Now, the generic did a couple of things for Marx. He did this, let's say, principle of homogenization. Between laborers. It was his theory of indistinction, of indeterminate potency. It was also the basis of his theory of why, let's say, our natural relation to production is the exteriorization of ourselves in our objects, because when we produce something new, it says something about ourselves. And capital was the one, or private property was responsible for estrangement and alienation. Now, with value theory, all of these changes, we have, as I said, the labor commodity, we have abstract labor, and we have the fact that if capital is the one that homogenizes and creates something distinct, it's also capital that creates a relation of exteriorization. You're only composable with the commodities you produce because your work is also commodified. So estrangement is the one that is negated by the value form, not exteriorization. So unification, homogenization, and externalization are all properties of the value theory, its effects over our activities. So we are left with the problem of estrangement, heterogeneity of activities, and a theory of indistinction that is not ontological. I swear that activities is written here. It's really crazy, but right? And a theory of we can no longer think in distinction or indetermination as a property as human potency. Sorry, indistinction is not, right? So my idea is that we can extract Badiou's theory of the generic procedures by the attempt to connect, given that after capital, how can we return to the positive ideas of the generic as a theory of novelty that concerns the participation of humanity in the universal? Well, we need a theory based on estrangement. It cannot homogenize or presuppose a homogeneity of activities, and it cannot treat indistinction as a given. It needs to construct it, right? This is the first part of my approach. Now, the second part of my approach is the following. So these are the conditions, right? The second condition is the following. If you look at the process of work, process of labor, the way that Marx describes it in chapter 5, it basically, I mean, it seems naive, but anyway, you have, how do you call it? It's not prime. How do you say materia prima in English? Raw material. Right, you have some material, it can be either raw or pre-processed. It is changed in accordance to some knowledge and some labor force. And it produces something else here, product. Marx uses this very stupid schema to talk about what differentiates human labor, for example, from the laboring bee, because I can take something, I can already use a knowledge to define how I'm going to apply my force onto it so that I produce a product that I planned, right? So bees can construct very complicated things, but cannot plan ahead what they're going to do. There's a nice, for the analytics in the room, there's a nice idea there that you can follow a rule, but you cannot obey a rule, let's say. So the interesting thing is that if you look at capitalism, what it actually does is that it distinguishes these things here. So it puts it all under commodity form. So you have commodification of knowledge and so on and so forth, patents and so on. The force of labor force is also, you have wages and commodification of labor, commodities in general here, and you also have, these are commodities that are pretty much indistinct from the from the product, but they can also be commons that were enclosed, right? So one way that I think that we can also derive the 4 procedures from this, and why my previous page suggests why after capital there is good reason to be distrustful of the idea that there is such a thing as a unified generic capacity. I think that a kind of common idea is that, for example, artistic practice shows that, for example, you don't need to have, right, because how is that this usually works? You have a determinate knowledge organizing a determinate way of applying force onto and changing a material to produce a determinate product. So for example, if you can come up, if there is such a thing as indeterminate activity of production, produce something we don't know what it is, this is where the site usually comes into. For example, the connection between the transformation of a material into a product. We could suppose that this is where art intervenes. For example, the fact that we know today with a complete theory coming from feminist theory that labor force is actually the name of a family unit. Because it actually pays for the social reproduction of the worker. And this includes everyone involved in the care. We could say that love intervenes here. Right? Then perhaps we could say science has something to do with this. And in a very weird way, insofar as this concerns the commons of the world, right? Things that are enclosed so that can become main material, which is pretty much the earth. You get politics here.
Wow. It actually works.
It kind of does. I mean, it is my first attempt at a, let's say, materialist account of, so things are not political because and then they intervene here. They are political because they intervene here. You see, like we would actually be able to invert this arrow here, right? The determination would come from the site of intervention, from the matter under intervention, the commons, right? Social relations, the privatization of knowledge, and if you can challenge that. But again, I think that there are many ways to show that this is insufficient. But at least it's a first draft of how to try to account for it in a less because I said so kind of way.
Yeah, because you know that thing that Badiou says that every procedure has a dual or like the reductionist side. We could say actually the ideal version of each, right? Art becomes design, love becomes sex, science becomes like technical. Becomes management. If you were to take the ideal dimension of each of the procedures, you would have like a very ideal production process.
That's true. Something I can see kind of what you're saying. I don't know very much how to develop this, and I was interested in using it in a text, but I think it's way too. I mean, of course, I don't think Badiou would ever like something like this because it's too historical. The idea that at some moment we start needing to think. I mean, we need to deal with the fact that capitalism puts different aspects into relation in certain ways and separate aspects in certain ways that, let's say, we're led to or challenged to come up with a theory of generic procedures that are separate procedures. But I think that we don't lose that much by trying to find a. I mean, I think this is the point where transcendental deductions won't really cut it, you know? I think a better approach will be one that finds good reasons to keep this distinction. And I think the idea that we should be wary of tying every novelty into a general theory of novelty with no specification. We lose something by doing that. So the first reason, right? And that if you're committed to an idea, you're also committed to the existence of other possible ideas, right? I think that's an internal commitment to the existence of an idea. If you think an idea, you had an idea, to think about it and to think what that idea is also to think first that you could have another, or other ideas are possible for that same problem and so on, that you're not going to solve everything with your idea, and also that your idea it applies under a certain set of conditions that if you try to now use it somewhere else, it's an ideal. It changes what it is. So I think there is a commitment when you have a commitment to the existence of ideas. It's already a commitment to multiple ideas, in the sense of qualitatively distinct. There is you want. It's not that you are. The world doesn't suggest this, but because the world doesn't suggest that there are ideas, but if you do take that position, then you get a more consistent view if you suppose that there are limits you shouldn't cross, unless you're in which case ideas will start functioning another way, right? So it's tied to, it's not context independent in that way. So I think that's a first approach that I think is something we want to keep, is let's say the philosophical aspect of defending that there are multiple procedures. But then I think there is a contingent point. But you is the first one to say, I don't know why there are 4. I only know of 4. And he almost says by experience. And it's true that he is a guy who is involved with many of these things. So we can have, let's say, a good, almost pragmatic or contingent historical reason for there being the consolidation of 4 distinct procedures that are not unifiable. They're not unifiable because when you unify them, well, we know how to unify them. That's called value theory of labor. But at the same time, we have no proposition over why there are only 4. We don't know that there must be that case, but we know that pragmatically it's good that there are at least 4. And we can always wait to see, okay, come up with something else. But I know that this doesn't really address completely what we were talking about, right? Because I do think that it makes a bit less abstract the idea that, okay, we have here something that it inscribes itself multiply in many things, but this arrow here leads to something like political thinking. This arrow here leads to something like artistic thinking. Okay, but what are these arrows? What are they answering to, or whatever, right?
Yeah, for me, it seems there's. I don't know if it is true, but yeah. Firstly, it is impressive. Okay, I'm more willing to concede of the separation because I know I'm in this room. I think I'm the guy who doesn't want to separate things. So I'm more willing to concede this. So it is impressive, but at the same time, I think you use 2 different ways to talk about what constitutes politics or art, etc. The first one was kind of a seeing as or something like this. You have the same multiple, and this multiple will participate in something like a political thinking, or it can participate in something like artistic thinking, and etc. And then the other approach for me, it lapses back, and this is its quality, actually, because I was going to ask you, okay, so what constitutes political thinking? What constitutes artistic thinking? So the last one, the graph you just erased, I think you, in a sense, you are separating them by their material, not by seeing as, not by their phenomenology, not by kinds of thinking, but by the place wherein such procedures intervene. So it has something to do with the material. So I think they are, I don't know if they are incompatible, but they are different, you know.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's why I said that. I think, yeah, I think we have a phenomenological one. We have this weird ontological argument, I'm putting it between brackets, which was the one about there must be multiple ideas. There is the historical one that I agree. I think it has a good, as most historical arguments do, they try to determine something about a space from its conditions, right? So I gave a condition of historical capitalism situation, and I said, this presents some structure that maps onto the differentiation, some differentiation at the level of politics, art, and so on. But I don't like how I did it, and I wouldn't subscribe to it, though I think it points towards something, because first, labor does not exist in the way Marx described it, like that. I mean, the very fact that if I were to write it properly, I would have to write that knowledge with the labor force, the material here, and the product. These are all relational terms, because labor is a product, knowledge is a product, this material is itself a product of previous knowledge and labor implication. So every one of these terms is actually all of the terms.
Yes, this was going to be my second question.
But do you see how we fall back onto the phenomenology? So if labor is the product of some knowledge of care, some unpaid labor by probably the guy's wife, acting on some material, and you saw it as labor rather than as knowledge, or you kind of enter into the other argument, the phenomenological one.
Yes.
So we could do that, though I think there's too little.
I don't think we should lapse back into that, because I think you'll be open to a gerrymandering accusation or something. You will use one when it's convenient, and you will use the other when it's convenient. So this is not really. If you are still open to this instability, it's still not a strong argument, I think. But it's a very good start.
Yeah, but my point is that
one way to approach this is to assume those as positions, not use relative terms, like Lacan discourses. Those are the positions. So when you say there is a position for material, there is a position for labor, there is a position for knowledge.
Yeah.
They are like roles, like object-oriented kind of approach to software design, that you have roles and then certain specific things come and partake in those roles, but those things may be the same, may be different underneath, but when they are on that role, act in that role.
Yes, this is exactly what Bogdanov proposed to reform Marx's theory of labor. His point was, labor is pretty much an organization reorganizing another organization to produce another organization. So there is, ontologically, I don't need to have substantial divisions. What they have is actually positions in where some organized system, for example, a living being exerting a certain effort, will function as labor, but it can also be the raw material for something else, and so on.
So your historical argument will say that in capitalism, there are 4 roles according to Marx's theory of labor.
Yes, it would end up with something like that. But I think that there's also 2 other arguments that I just briefly wanted to sketch. One is the Kantian one. Why not call it like that? Which I think, this version of it, I took it from Kantian. I took it from this Japanese guy, Karatani, who has this concept of parallax. And the parallax is very much a good way of approaching this problem, because what he says is, look, in Kant, we already have something like a multiple, and we have a double operation on the multiple. If you put into brackets certain aspects of it, for example, the questions of the good and the questions of the pleasant. So if you don't ask about pleasant, so it's almost like this. You have, yes, if you bracket those, you only get the question of if it's true. And then you have science. If you bracket the question of the true and the good, you get the question of the pleasant, and you get aesthetics. If you bracket the question of the pleasant and the true, you constitute the question of the good, and you get ethics. So it's of the same object that you can ask, is it good? Is it pleasant? Is it true? But you cannot ask from within the same discipline in a certain sense. So you bracket something out so that it constitutes a certain field of inquiry. So he calls the shifts between these things, so where you bracket different aspects of a same multiple in order to constitute a consistent inquiry, a parallax shift. So you see, you don't need to presuppose a substantial field. It's pretty much a transcendental reduction, right? But a theory where transcendental reduction is relative, it's not absolute, in the sense that it can be unbracketed for the privilege of another issue. So it's kind of the same idea that we were having there. But the true, the good, the pleasant.
I would say the beautiful, not the pleasant, but okay.
Yeah, the beautiful, of course. Yeah, the pleasant, I don't know why I translated like that, but definitely, yes, of course. Right? You can do it like this. So this is let's say, a restricted situation where we can write the beautiful, the good, and the true, depending on what you bracket, or these two, you get one of the questions in a consistent form. If you try to deal with the three questions asked of the same object at the same time, you don't get a consistent field of inquiry, right? So this is another approach to the same idea. For example, Alenka Zupančić seems to suggest that the reason why, right, ethics is substituted for politics here, you get art here, you get science, but love is also included, something that Kant would not include. For her, it's because love is not about either one of the three, but about the possibility of shifting. Because it's all about, for Lacan, the non-relation and so on and so forth, right? But I do think it's trying to squeeze Badiou into this thing. I'm not sure if it's the best approach, but this is another way of saying, well, if we found another way of bracketing aspects of a multiple to produce a consistent field of inquiry, we would just add it here as a fourth. And it's true, in my opinion, that the biggest innovation philosophically for Badiou is not for us to consider science, politics, and art as truth procedures, but love. Love is the weird one to call a truth procedure by far. So this is also another argument that I think it's possible. And finally, the one that I think goes the close. I mean, I'm terribly skeptic of the idea that we can deduce from the material. For example, in the historical argument, I think that it tends to give us a more determinate view of what these things are. We say, but what is politics? And I say, it deals with the common. Okay, you gave me some contours. But it's problematic in the sense that it's one of those situations where you're not sure if you're not gonna restrict too much, right? By, let's say, making politics coextensive with some material, even if it's a position. It's a kind of weird, though I do think that there's some truth to it. And I think that perhaps it's because it needs to be supplemented by a Hegelian argument, which is the crazy one, and that in a pure form makes absolutely no sense, which is politics is the thinking of what the hell politics is. Art is the thinking of what the hell art is, and so on and so forth. So you could bind this tree in this way, that, okay, there is a, let's say, a lower bound given by the material, some way of understanding how this material informs what takes place in the space. But is this then a contoured space, a defined interiority? No, because it's precisely doing this and questioning what the hell is this boundary. It's not simply a matter of being bound by a material, because as Dennis said, for example, management does the same thing. Tragedy of the commons, how are we going to distribute scarce resources with infinite demands? It's very much defined from this point. Human resources will pretty much deal with labor force, families, and so on, by taking it as the position from which it starts and coming up with a certain field of actions on it. But to turn it into, to reintroduce the generic, you introduce this weird speculative. It's more than Hegelian, right? It's a speculative argument.
I didn't understand, when did you reintroduce the generic?
We reconstructed it, right? In the sense that we're giving it a site in a situation. We're giving it a sort of self-transforming property here. We're saying that it's multiple and not one. And even though ultimately this material is shared by everything, it's not qualitatively distinct. So we're taking that phenomenon. So we're trying to give all these arguments to reconstruct what a generic procedure is, rather than depart from it, right? So, I mean, I didn't introduce the generic in the sense of adding it to the schema, but I'm trying to see if I can arrive at some of its very broad properties by not presupposing it and then getting to it, right? Getting to it in a multiple sense, and not simply in the sense that there is one thing, this one thing that is the generic. And what I like about this, what I think is essential about the idea of there being multiple, even if we cannot say that there are four, is that this is what will ultimately locate philosophy with some task. Because only for philosophy can we talk about generic procedure in the singular somehow, right? That's why for Badiou, ontologically, there are truths, and only for philosophy is there the category of truth with a capital T as a sort of creative concept we use to try to make compossible what happens in so many different fields, right? For example, we use the concept of critique with a capital C to make sense of Kant's strategy in totally distinct fields, as this field of the beautiful, the good, and the true. Because those different strategies, they do have this basic structure underneath of, well, let's go to the what's presupposed by this constituted reality, and this will take us to something that is broader, and so on and so forth. So unity happens at the level of philosophy, and multiplicity happens at the level of the procedures, right? Anyway, this is all very sketchy. We could go into what would give this schema a generic quality in a similar sense to the one that Marx proposed, but this would require us to go into, let's say, the inner structure, and it's more, let's say, common ground for within Badiou literature. What I think that we don't see in the literature are attempts to propose arguments, and I think I'm trying to accumulate some here for the multiplicity of procedures, right? Though I'm not sure which ones are the most convincing ones and if they get us where we need to go.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. One thing throughout all of these arguments is the tension between the ideal and the idea, kind of transposed into different areas.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like the truth procedures. Well, for one, I would like to ask the question: do you think there can be an idea without an ideal? Also, kind of lurking in the background. Like, isn't every idea always threatened by the shadow of an ideal, in the sense that someone can always come around and say, oh, you thought this was new and novel, but it was just a return to the same.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, if I were to very blunt, I think that the whole point of Badiou's theory is to remove the substantialist distinction, or if there was ever substantial, but qualitative distinction between ideals and ideas, and give us an organizational distinction, because ideals are ways to organize situations based on known predicates, right? And he equates and brings the theory of ideas into play precisely there where unmotivated, but at the same time relevant processes construct something that is indiscernible, so on and so forth, right? So just very much, I mean, ideals and ideas is just a nicer way to talk about the distinction between knowledge and truth for Badiou, I think. And the cool thing about knowledge and truth in Badiou's ontology is that there is no substantial distinction. Is a distinction of structure, right?
I see. So you mean like how it's to what purpose it's used within a situation, something like that.
Yeah, like constructible. If you can construct if you can separate a set through a predicate, it's pretty much an operation of the encyclopedia as a knowledge, right? And if the thing being separated, you cannot, it's impredicative under specific conditions. It's not simply without predicate, but it's generic in the double sense of being including the most common, tending towards the most common elements of the situation, and at the same time generic in the sense of generating a rule of construction that cannot be predicated before being constructed, right? Then it has that structure. But you know if it is one thing or another, not because of what it is, but because of what it's doing, right? It's a distinction between, let's say, there's this cool word I learned recently, hodological. Have you heard of it? It's like hodology is a study of paths in a space. Like ideals, let's say, map a certain number of paths in a space based on our capacity to construct the predicates that organize that map. So it limits the hodological space in a certain way, while ideas supposedly, I mean, there's this terrible saying in Portuguese and Spanish, is a very popular idea that you make the way, you construct the road by walking. But it's very, I hate it because it's so cheesy in our political culture. But anyway, it has some truth to the idea that you first take a step and then interactively you now have part of the rule you followed, right? But you cannot explicitate it beforehand. But ultimately, the distinction between ideas and ideals has no qualitative value whatsoever. That's also why it's not context independent. To write a song for the people in trenches in Commune of Paris, Paris Commune might have been an idea, in the sense of might participate in a certain idea of what Christine Ross later called communal luxury, and a certain way of, looking for solidarity, not through the sort of debasement towards the dispossessed, but kind of pointing towards, you still enjoy the nice things, let's say. It's an idea for a situation, and the Paris Commune had many of those things. But then if you suppose that you can always do this in all situations and it will produce the same effect, it's kind of not understanding what was the idea. The idea was not writing music. The idea was writing music in that context, in that way, for producing a certain purpose and then dealing with that and so on and so forth. The whole path, right, is the trajectory that counts. So I like the distinction between ideals and ideas, because I think they're very easy to, it's very easy to talk about these things in those terms, better than truth and knowledge with all the Heideggerian thing and constructible versus generic orientations. But simply, I think it's nice, it's easier to put, and again, it explains why ideas are always in tension with ideals, as you put it, because they are made of the same stuff.
Yeah, that the distinction between them gets erased if you leave the situation in which
Exactly. Perfect.
they were born, right? If you, yeah, in a different situation, like if you were to, I don't know, make a T-shirt out of it or something, it would be, it would totally lose its that distinction.
Yeah, I think again, it's a situated distinction, right? And that's the cool thing about Badiou's ontology. In the end, it's a theory of very broad things that never leave the fact that they're context dependent. That they only acquire that structure with regards to the material of the situation and the structure of the situation. It's not relative to it. It's not a theory of, if you always do this, it will always have the same effect. It will always be this. So, for example, it's something that I think, for example, Lacanians have a problem with, because there is this kind of metaphysical idea that if you point towards the contingent, surprising, unseen, you're always going to be moving towards the real. Whereas it's obvious, if you have a boring Lacanian friend, that 99% of the time, this is not doing anything, right? But because you generalize from something that happens in certain clinical situations, and it's quite amazing that Lacan suggests that interventions might take that form, that you generalize and assume that this is the form, right? So it's taking a Lacanian idea and turning it into an ideal. But it's precisely because the finesse of the context dependence aspect of it, how you actually move towards something else, you lose all of this and just take it for an idealist theory of ideas, right?
But I would also say that this is, or just one more point.
Sure.
The problem or the weakness I see here is that it almost sounds like the idea is something that, by definition, cannot be reproduced. If you have obtained the formula for reproducing it, you have arrived at the ideal. Whereas when we talk about politics and organizing people, a lot of it is about rules for reproduction, right? Going to the same place every day, meeting with the same people, discussing the same things, or it's a lot about repetition and reproduction. So isn't that why political movements and political experiments tend to, become, or they appear to become ossified, right? Because you're always you're duplicating things inherently, intrinsically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see what you mean, but like I think that this is also why I think Badiou had to move towards a theory of worlds and not only a theory of an ontology of these things. Because, for example, when you come up with a set of rules that you follow in the way that you meet people, who you meet, how you meet, and things like this, you're also testing something to see if that works for a certain purpose. It might not work, then you try something else, things like this. If you take a snapshot in a political movement, in the same way that you would take a snapshot, perhaps, I mean, I would even say that this is not valid for any of the procedures that Badiou calls procedures. I mean, what I think they all have in common is that none of them take place at the scale of a meaningful individual temporality, right? It's a common feature, in fact, I think. Like, even love, which you would think in terms of how it affects you individually, immediately, and so on, even in that case, I like the way Badiou is quite prudent in separating this seduction, infatuation moment of the encounter from what it means to, what he says, experience the world from the standpoint of the two, which is something slow, we don't really know how that's going to happen, and things like this. So it's never really on the scale of individuals. So I think that's a common way of getting the problem wrong, because from the scale of an organization, a snapshot doesn't really last, for example, the interval between two meetings, right? You should probably let the camera run a bit longer before you can see what it means to reproduce or to produce something. That you met once and met again, okay, you did something and did something again. Is that an ideal? Because it's the ideal of having a meeting. Okay, in a sense, but at the same time, meet again and again and again. Perhaps what happens in 3 months worth of meetings goes in one direction, the way you deal with things, whereas it could have gone in another, and then you have a better picture of the form at stake, right? So I think you need to be careful also not to I mean, this distinction between ideals and ideas, which I like in a sense. I think it's also different to use them as ways to evaluate how I am going to relate to a procedure, and use them as ways to understand how a procedure relates to itself. So one thing is to say, I'm coming into politics because I have an idea, but well, if I continue doing it, it's no longer an idea because it's reproduction, it's therefore an ideal. Okay, perhaps, but it means something very small. Whereas to say, the common sense is that organizations should not have a leader, or that they should not try to be uniform or play with rules. We're going to try to play with rules, uniformity, and see what happens, because we have this way of doing that. So the lead, we're not really asking about reproduction and production in this simple testable sense, right? And I think that the very question, is this just reproduction, or is this producing something? When you ask this, you're close to the problem of an idea, because it's usually not something very discernible, right? So the very fact you have the issue, the question is itself a sign that something undecidable is at stake sometimes, right? So I don't think it's a clear-cut distinction, neither in the ontological sense, as we spoke about, because it deals with structures made of the same stuff, let's say, neither phenomenologically, because having to draw the line and say, no, this is new, is part of what doing something new is about, right? So it's not clear-cut in any sense, I think. But also, just there's something you said I wanted to return. I forgot now. There's this ideal and idea distinction, the scale thing. Yeah, I forgot. I had another comment, but yeah. Anyway, I hope this is a good way to start this discussion, even though I know it's complicated in many. It's not very developed yet, but a very much committed to this idea recently. I have to write a text about this. I'm reviewing one of Badiou's texts, Can Politics Be Thought? And I'm very much committed to this idea that very kind of mainstream approaches to the deadlocks of Marxism today, from the standpoint of political economy, the crisis of value, the incongruity between analysis of nation, analysis of states, and analysis of capital, the changes in the position of the worker as a revolutionary category, a bunch of very hot debated Marxist terms. I think they find a very interesting response in Badiou's system, to the point that it looks like one thing came out of the other. It came out of those debates. So I'm interested in reconstructing some of the ideas that appear in his political theory in more clear Marxist jargon, if you want, just to clarify that the dialogue is much, much richer than it seems at first. But yeah, this is my first attempt at this kind of derivation of a theory of the generic as a multiple set of procedures out of the deadlocks of Marx's theory of generic as a common one procedure. I remember what it is that I wanted to say then. Is the thing about the idea not being able to be regular, because this entails reproduction, is solved by the fact, I mean, again, in this more simplified interpretation that I'm giving with these terms, ideas, ideals, and so on, to talk about Badiou, but this is solved by the very cool solution of, rather than saying that ideas introduce a new distinction, by saying that ideas introduce an indistinction. And because ideas are an indistinction in a situation, you cannot separate them from the production of another indistinction in another situation of similar property. So ideas are transhistorical, not because they differentiate themselves from a situation and produce a new distinct thing, but because they indifferentiate themselves from a situation. And because they are indifferent, indifference is like another indifference, because if it was different, it would be differentiatable, and therefore a difference, not an indifference. So the transitivity between situations, the availability of an idea for another situation, another historical time, concerns the process of it being indistinct to its context. Its autonomization is conditioned by a process of indifferentiation and not by a process of differentiation. So if it was a matter of distinction, every idea would automatically become a sort of positive universal or positive concept that can or cannot apply somewhere else. But because ideas concern an indistinction and an indifferentiation, Badiou organizes on this side their availability across time. Sophocles doesn't mean the same thing for a Greek world and for us, but it remains available for us as a thinking about aesthetics, art, and theater, and so on, because it made itself indistinct to the Greek context. Right? So it makes itself anachronistic, not because it's determinate and different from its context, but because it's too indistinct. So it's too indistinct for the Greek context, too indistinct for our context, and we're constantly interpreting what the fuck that indistinction is. So I like that way out as well, which is you don't universalize by positing a difference that is valid for all contexts. You universalize, that's why the generic is connected to the common, right? By moving towards the indistinct. And I like this. I once had opportunity to ask Badiou about this, and I was pleased that he liked the formulation. But the idea is, mostly philosophy says that things are common because they are true. So first you postulate something as true, therefore it's absolute, therefore it's valid for all contexts, therefore it's common. In Badiou's ontology, things are true because they're common. So first you have a process of making something indistinct to a situation. If it's indistinct to that situation, it's when you refer to it, you refer to something that is common to the situation as a whole. Therefore, it is true. So the common comes first, the truth comes second, unlike most places where, because you're affirming truth, you're arriving at the common, right? So I think that this solution, so usually you get difference, true difference, common, positive commonness. With Badiou, you get indifference, negative common, and then you get truth. Which is crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. So yeah, I see what you're saying, that the whole regularity thing. First, I mean, I think you gave two different arguments. One is the scale thing, like who's to say an individual can really tell the difference between what is new on the level of something like a political movement or an artistic movement. Like who can really tell, right? But also at the level of this indistinction, that it's actually a proof that you cannot tell. That's almost a proof of its novelty, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you could take your current categories and find the correct way to place this new thing, then that would prove that it wasn't new. It would just be something.
I think I told you this once. I had a friend when I was in high school, and it was a very important experience for me. I was sitting during lunchtime or whatever. He sat next to me and he said, "Look at that girl. Is she pretty?" Like a question. And I had such a feeling that he was in love. Like the fact that he didn't know, but he was so, I mean, I could tell he was interested in something. He didn't know what it was in that girl. But the fact that he didn't know already meant he was looking at her in a very weird way, very different way. So there is this nice idea that, like, if you pose the question, like, is this within a parameter or not? Like, is this ordinary or not? That's more a mark of the extraordinary than if you say this is bombastically new and this is obviously what I've been waiting for, right? Usually, I mean, this is exactly how people mistake infatuation for anything. Like, you're exactly what I was expecting. Like, my Prince Charming. This is right. I mean, this is the ideal as it comes. So yeah. It's funny that you get to kind of think more structurally about this weird phenomenology of, it's not that I have been convened by the moment, by an event to decide. So it's not a spectacular moment. It's that I'm not sure if there's something to decide, because there is determination in missing. There is a scarcity of determination. It's not, let's say, I think it is a much better image of the event, like a figure of events, than St. Paul in the horse, right? Even though the full story of St. Paul is much more interesting, right? I love the story of Maimonides, of Ramon Lull, that mystic from the 13th century. I love that he's said to have seen God in a vision, and God told him, he was like a bohemian guy. He was one day in bed with a woman. God appeared to him and said, "Lull, you need to follow me. I have a mission for you." And Lull said, "You're delirious. I'm delirious. This is not true. Forget this." And apparently God had to appear to him many, many, many times before he was convinced. Is this something? I'm not really sure. Right? And St. Paul as well, the way that St. Paul falls from the horse, but then the guy who was a Christian comes to take care of him. I mean, the story is more complex than simply, I saw a vision and it posed the problem. Decide here, follow the rule, the status quo, or go into something new. It's even the let's say, the resources to define that there is a moment to decide something are not given, right? But you put it very nicely when he says that well, whatever it is that we're calling an event here, it definitely does not teach you how to be faithful to it. Like, that an event has happened does not entail how to follow that event, how to do anything with it. So it's not really a determining moment of something else, but a moment where you don't even know if there's something to decide, right? It's more like when the wind stops and you feel like, okay, this is weird. There should be some wind here, like moving things in that direction, rather than like a perfect storm of a sublime moment and so on. So this is a phenomenological problem, but I think it's good to see that we should tend more towards, you know, the problem of setting a division between the two terms rather than trying to find the properties of that differentiate the two.
I have two autobiographically loaded observations. One of them, I gave an interview this morning to somebody in Germany, and he asked me, what is the relationship between your activity as a musician, artist, whatever, and a theoretician? And I answered something like, I think of the music I do as a form of philosophy. This is the first one. So philosophy is not a condition. I understand for Badiou.
No, who gives a shit? Yes.
Yeah, but my argument was he was talking. I see you something like this. I see you in the tradition of Greenberg, the art theoretician, like
Clement.
somebody Clement Greenberg. Yes, as somebody who is not interested in repeating Wagner or whatever, who's a modernist in a sense. Yeah, but I answered him. Yes, I can use Greenberg to answer you because okay, you can see me as a modernist in a sense because I'm not saying that I'm an event. Okay, guys, I'm just saying that I have ambitions
Sure.
that are akin to modernism, right? I have like a ideal, perhaps not an idea, but the ideal of modernism is still important for me. So okay, I have in common with this account the fact that I'm a modernist of sorts. I see myself that way. Okay, it's my self understanding. You can bracket that as well. So this is why I'm talking of autobiographically charged observations. So, but the second part, I told him I can use Greenberg negatively because Greenberg was very attached to medium specificity.
Mm-hmm.
You thought art, literally what you saw, what you were talking about the Hegelian account. He thought art was talking about art because art was reflecting on its medium. So medium specificity was very important for this account. And I told him, I'm not attached to medium specificity. When I do things like Breviário, the record with a book that comes with a book and all of that, I'm not at all attached to medium specificity in a sense that I'm not interested in musical categories per se, but more interested in categorical transitions between things like a score that can become a poem, that can become a picture, that can become a score again, and things like that, categorical transitions. So this is kind of, I tend to think of it like a philosophical problem of sorts, but it's put into practice. It's embodied in a product, not in a theory, but in a product. Second autobiographically loaded observation. My current companion, I met her during a performance of her, and I thought maybe you guys will say that there was two events, not one, because there was a love event simultaneously as an art event, but the sequence that events started was a sequence that at all times was feeding off each other, be it the love sequence as much as the art sequence, because what I liked her performance as much as I liked her in the first moment. And that was a big, like, I remember something you said today, Gabriel, that art is a procedure that has as its receptors other artworks. So I can draw from that and think, well, much of what I was doing after that was responding to what I saw Sananda doing. So, okay, I understand the methodological interest in keeping them separate, because of course somebody who sees our works are not seeing our relationship, are seeing the works. But there is a dimension in all of that, that there is a transitivity between conditions, between the four conditions. There is a transformability between them.
What I totally agree with you, and I mean, in many ways, I think this is the case. For example, I think that I would try to remove the most from this discussion any impression that it means that an action cannot be inscribed into two procedures at once. In the sense, for example, that if you sit down to compose something together with your partner, you are at the same time participating on something that has some artistic import and something that participates in your relationship. What is actually done in the world is totally heterogeneous and mixed. But the point is, there is a heuristic value, right, to the fact that those two things can be distinguished, and that still there is something useful in talking about the fact that the same action is being written in two systems at once, right?
Yeah,
because
yes, I agree. It is useful. Yes,
it's useful. I mean, it's useful also in the sense that it's even more complicated because, for example, you can, let's say, hypothetically, be in a situation where you turn to the other person and says, for example, we did that thing the way that we did it because it was love. You weren't really into doing that in that particular way. Sure, the end result is interesting and so on, but you motivated certain choices or you restricted yourself in certain ways due to things that don't concern art, concern something else. I mean, in that sense, the funny thing is, for example, there is a very clear political constraint over artistic practice that comes from funding and the cost of materials. From the standpoint of how these constraints will affect artistic practice, economic constraints and relationship constraints are both material constraints, right? In the sense that they reduce the space of what you could have done. You cannot buy the piano you wanted, and you can also, you need to negotiate with your partner without hurting their feelings, or you want to explore something with them that's also part of your relationship. This will constrain the space of what you guys can do. It's an added interesting constraint. Just as punk had to deal with economic constraints, to the material, the gear that they used.
And now you have to repeat that because otherwise you are like a sellout.
What do you mean?
I mean, punk's become
yes.
like, yeah, you are a sellout if you have good gear. So you, even if you have money, you have to
continue doing it. Yes, exactly.
Restrain yourself because this is the ideal, not the idea anymore.
Exactly. Yeah, true. What is a punk with no economic constraints? After all, it remains a problem, an open problem. But it's just to say that this is what I like about Karatani's theory of the parallax, in the sense that when you bracket something, and by bracket you separate form from material, in that sense, it's a very relative distinction, right? In this sense, why are we're only for the sake of, it's only from the standpoint of a thinking that relationship and economic constraints are material constraints that are, let's say, restricting the space of artistic exploration, investigation, right? From the standpoint of economy, the fact that you have an artistic practice is constraining our budget, right? Or the fact that you cannot you have totally distinct aesthetic approaches to art might add a constraint to your love relationship, and those are material constraints that the form of love that you're inventing will have to accommodate, deal with, and find a way to do. But so you don't need to ever have a stratified, consolidated theory of this informs that. You can keep all of that into a big mixture, but it seems like thinking does these two things at once. It will draw a line over what is matter and what is form. That is, let's say, specific line, the placed contextually, case by case, right? It can be a point where it changes. I don't know, right? But the moment that line is drawn, a certain level of consistency into what has been left on the side of form becomes clear, and a certain space for invention and so on. You can move it around, but nevertheless, it seems like it's conceptually enriching to add that into the approach rather than to remove it and say everything can inscribe everywhere. Sure, but there are conditions as to how it inscribes, and you are not in control of those conditions somehow. So what is, right? What is determining it? And I think that history of the field, and I find this very interesting how, for example, you were talking about this sort of interest in the transformability. Like there's something that is weirdly invariant and at the same time strangely variant when you move from score to poem to picture to music to something else. Like when you put all of that into a series and you ask, okay, but what the fuck is common to all of this? It's very much a particular experimental way of seeing what is common to all of that by indistinction, because it's not going to be by a positive property, right? So there is something to it, and it's, I mean, I don't think it's for nothing that the debate over specification in art is so distinct than in other fields. For example, science deals with the fact that there are many sciences in a different way than art deals with the fact that there are many arts. And politics almost does not admit the idea that there are many politics. It seems like there is one politics, and if there is gender politics, race politics, and class politics, we've done something wrong. Mm-hmm. But perhaps it's time to learn from art and science, you know. Perhaps, you know, there is something philosophy could do there to say, look, there isn't a way of looking at generic procedures where the inner differentiation within these procedures is not really a sign of fragmentation or whatever politics says, but something that just happens, right? And I find it interesting because there is a very similar, just to wrap this up, there's a very similar ambition behind Badiou's vision of philosophy as this weird, he says this thing that in a sense he agrees with the most radical early Wittgenstein kind of approach. He says philosophy has never produced a truth proposition ever. There is simply no true statements in philosophy. That's not what philosophy is about. But there are true statements in other places, and the whole point is, okay, how can you accept that there is something true in art and politics and science? Because they're not directly commensurate. So this idea that philosophy is somehow concerned with a world after the specialization of fields is very similar to what Bogdanov thought. This Bogdanov guy, he said, look, the history of capitalism is the history of amazing advancement in knowledge, but at the same time, this was overdetermined by the social division, technical division of labor. Everyone knows a bit about something, and this way we know a lot about many things. He says that what he wanted to develop with what he called techtology is a way of thinking about knowledge in a communist society where we're going to overcome the technical division of labor, but at the same time, evidently, not everyone's going to know everything in the same way. So his approach was to say, what all these different fields have in common? They have in common the fact that they organize things. Labor management organizes things, science organizes things, art organizes things. So a theory of organization is a theory of what they have in common. A theory of, so he had a similar approach with a, let's say, proto theory of complex systems rather than set theory, category theory, and this very potent, robust tools. But there is some similar intuition that there is a multiplicity of procedures going on, and you need to really go to some very weird abstract level to be able to recompose what they have in common, because they are truly distinct. It's not at a level of any empirical, ontological, direct property that they have that you're going to be able to extract their commonality. You're going to have to create something very abstract and indirect somehow.
Yeah, I think I find similarities with what I was proposing, in the sense that my gateway outside of music was the normativity itself, which I found to be common to several different practices. This is what I was talking in the first presentation about the constitution of a generic practice, which is a practice which deals with normativity as such. Or perhaps this could be changed to organization, normativity and organization. This is very, are very connected terms. I mean,
what I wanted to ask you about your proposal that was it's a point that interests me very much, because there's a discussion between Badiou and Lyotard. Actually, Badiou talking about Lyotard. When Lyotard published Les Différents, I forgot what it's called, Badiou makes this remark about him. He says, this guy produced a very interesting kind of Kantian/Wittgensteinian theory, philosophical theory, based on the idea that norms are a generic or a good primitive term. And he says the problem is that norms still presuppose a certain domain of applicability. And the different was all about this, the idea that, let's say, rules apply to in some level to a domain or community, and you can have a difference between differences, so that two rules are incommensurable in the sense that you cannot even translate them, right? So the notion of norm presupposed the idea of a community to which it applies somehow. And Badiou says, well, but this is not the most general concept, because we know of rules that are not norms. And those are the rules of formal systems. The rules in formalization are broader than the rules that take a normative status, because norms rule over definite domains. So they are, let's say, in Lyotard's parlance, they are, let's say, culturally specific, right? And he says the difference is formalisms don't rule over anything. That's why they rule over everything. That's why science is not context specific. So he says, I want a broader theory of rules than the theory of norms. So I see you kind of forcing norms to be very general, and I wonder at what point we will need to keep the idea of rules, but this sort of kind of context relation, reference relation to specificity of applications, implicit, explicit, blah, 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 all of this will come into contrast with the generalizing impetus, you know?
Yes, yeah, that's a good question. And perhaps it's obviously there's a difference. I'm listening to my own voice, so it's kind of tricky. Yeah, there's a difference in, the traditions that we come from. I would say I'm very attached to the idea of norms, or was up until here, because first, I'm not a Platonist. I'm much more of a nominalist. I'm a nominalist. This is a fact. I'm a nominalist, much more than a Platonist. So I would like, I tend to think of rules and norms in terms of natural science and not in terms of math or formal systems. So my basic duality is not between rules as in formal systems and norms, but between regularities in natural systems and norms as pattern governed behavior that looks into pattern governed behavior. So there's a recursion that produces something like rule obeying behavior, which is different from pattern governed behavior. So the fact that I'm talking about pattern governed behavior and not just the pattern accuses my naturalism in this sense.
Yes.
Yeah. So yes.
But this, I think that, I mean, this is the that's why I think that in the end of the day, you know, the infinite is always a good Rosetta Stone for positions, because that's why, I mean, physics doesn't really need that concept in the same way that mathematics. What really sets mathematics apart is this: what is the quality of this particular set of norms or rules or whatever that puts us into relation with something that by definition contradicts behavior, because there can be no
infinite.
Finite. Yeah, that's what the problem we're talking about. I think that it is the complicated thing. These days I think that the only way to deal with this, the way I read, for example, your position, and I think that it remains one of the most productive principles to maintain, is I will not accept an entity or a process or something that I cannot condition on specific procedures for its production. So if I say the infinite, but look, I cannot produce it, it must be given. I say, okay, where? From the heavens, right? So one of my impressions is one of the really cool things that needs to be developed today, and Marxism failed at it. I think naturalist approaches to it are also usually not very developed. I think, weirdly enough, in a very weird twist of fate, I think Zizek has better tools to deal with this than Badiou himself. But how to give, let's say, cognitive, localized, naturalistic account of how something like a formal thinking could emerge out of, that's something I think it's the open question, because
this is very important. Yes, this is crucial, I think.
I think the reason why I think Zizek is more equipped for this, because in that argument we were having today, for example, about Rockman's critique of infinity and so on, what everyone gets into problem with is that you need to suppose an other that counts to infinity, because we can never be us. Nobody can be the subject of that counting. But you end up supposing another that counts. And that idea that supposing another that counts to infinity is supposing another is an effective part of a procedure and of something that you can construct something out of that. I think it's something that is still regarded as a highly weird way to approach things, and it's like Zizek's bread and butter. So to show how you can actually, let's say, wager on something no one can do, but it takes an important and
but I think the Zizekian notion is interesting because it also plugs into some more, I would say, I don't think Wittgenstein is a naturalist philosopher at all. I think he's a transcendental philosopher, but okay. But plugs into something that is, let us say, more compatible with naturalism, such as we were talking about today, the observations about the golden thing. I don't remember the name of the book, by Fraser, Wittgenstein, about Fraser.
Golden Bowl.
Yeah, Golden Bowl. That's it. And the idea that, do you think they are doing it because they believe it? They are doing it because they believe everybody else believe it.
Yes.
So this is maybe a gateway to understanding a kind of behavior that can accommodate some of the more radical consequences of the the rules of formal rules of formalism.
Yeah, I do think that if we want to kind of move from,
And it was taken up by David Lewis, right? You were talking about the other day, his theory of convention is something that ends up a bit there, even though David Lewis, of course, is not a naturalist, but at least because he has this analytic philosopher pedigree, he starts from a place where in natural science is very respected. I mean, it's not the same. Normally, it's not the default position in continental philosophy. It's
True.
just that I'm hinting at.
But I do think that this is, I mean, for example, I think that Badiou is much more concerned directly in this case with saying, look, we operate on this. It's almost like he is the pragmatist in this sense. Like, we use this produces things. So why are you shutting it off?
Yeah.
So,
I think this is a good argument. I think, yes.
And yeah, I think it's a good argument. But on the other side, let's say dialectical materialism, historical materialism, most theories of, the philosophical basis of intuitionism and constructivism in mathematics, all of them say, okay, I want to arrive at it.
Yeah.
And then you get the problem. So I don't want to show that it already exists. I want to arrive at its existence. Then
the problem, you want to explain it in a sense, and to explain it from its causes.
Yes.
And to explain it from its causes is to naturalize it. There's no other way. This is what explaining from the causes is. So I think this is the problem. Yes, you can accept that you can do things with it pragmatically and stuff. So I don't have much beef with the pragmatic approach. But yes, we would like to explain it somehow.
Reza, you were saying?
Yeah, but coming back to the differentiation between ideas and ideals, I think this would be one of the differentiations that causal approach does not work for ideas. Ideas don't have this generative or genesis-based approach. You cannot generate an idea. Idea is a way for us to be able to think more of a particular situation. And the point is that infinity as an idea allows us to think more of the properties of multiples, without which we cannot think more. So this is probably the pragmatic aspect that you're saying Badiou adopts, and that is exactly the situation in which, or the condition in which we are able to think more, to push the envelope of thinking a little bit farther. So this is exactly how I think a Platonist would approach the forms, or the way that Lautzmann approached the generalities, that you don't need to be able to generate generalities from other generalities. It is just enough to be able to create generalities in a way that more properties of particulars, or even more particulars, can be thought, without being able to even describe why those generalities are true or false. The generalities don't have truth or falsity.
Yes, I think that another way of saying this, and go back to the previous discussion on interlocking of love and art and things like this. For example, when we say that axioms are unmotivated propositions, it's not to say that they're unmotivated absolutely. For example, it's obvious that the philosophies that underlies Zermelo's thinking, or his relation to a bunch of other things, definitely influence what he thinks is the form of an axiom, but that motivation is not contained in the axiom, right? And for example, it's clear that there is a phenomenological motivation for Euclid to say that two parallel lines only meet at infinity. But that motivation is not included in the axiom. So the axiom is motivated in the sense that you could even explain in some level what generated the proposition, its motivation. It's of course not ex nihilo in the sense that it comes from heaven, but even in that case, you will not have exhausted it, because what follows from it is not contained in the motivations, and not even its necessity is contained in the motivation. So axiomatization is never really about, let's come up with arbitrary rules of a game. They can be totally motivated by some criteria. Still, they will be unmotivated, right?
But I think the way that Lautzman approaches this is very, very pragmatic and experimental. The motivation is just the ability the ability to think more of a situation.
Yeah, but what I wanted to do, Reza, is to separate the experimental from the pragmatic, because this idea that axioms are unmotivated, even if they're motivated, brings, let's say, a certain Platonism from within the pragmatics, right? A certain gap between the axiom and its motivation, even if it's totally motivated by whatever. But then the experimental is what you're now adding, which is, okay, but how do you verify if that axiom, we want to keep it or not, right? It's by those two basic criteria. Is it going to add a weird contradiction to what it was added? And let's say a negative condition, and a positive one is, does it enrich the space?
And that is exactly how mathematics developed. There are tons of axioms that actually originally was included, and then it got excluded to the point that we are reaching a system of stable axiomatic with ZFC.
Yes.
Axiom of choice, right? Axiom of choice is still under debate. A lot of people don't believe in axiom of choice. But axiom of choice can describe properties of multiples that without axiom of choice you couldn't. But it is certainly valid not to have a mathematics with an axiom of choice. There are a lot of other axioms that are similar to this. Axiom of foundation is another one. So my point is, there is no need to differentiate the experimental aspect from the language of motivation. What I'm trying to say is that we don't have, or at least the way that I read Lautzman doesn't use the language of motivation as some backdrop, some background in order to bring in more of generalities. The way that he describes the process is very, very experimental based, that you have a complex scenario, a complex situation, you break it down to a simpler situation, and if the generalities that allow you to break it down helps you in that, then so be it. If not, then you come up with a new generality to allow you for this, to allow you to perform this breakdown process. So the language of motivation at least does not come in the explanatory system in Lautzman.
Yes, my point, but again, even if it does come in the sense that if he wants to do a history of Zermelo coming up with the system, you could add, but it simply doesn't follow from it anything, right? So I just wanted to suggest that it's not simply, we don't need to treat axioms as ex nihilo statements and then ask where they come from.
What I'm trying to say is that axioms are not grounded.
Yes, but that's a property of the axiom, not of the history of the axiom.
Well, and even the history of axiom, you don't have to necessarily ground it. I get the point that infinity is a very very peculiar situation because of all the metaphysics associated with it. But certainly other axioms don't have this pedigree. And the way that they come in and they go out is absolutely based on the ability to be able to explain more things or not.
Yes. No, but what I want, but yeah, sure. Okay, it's just that I'm trying to make a precision on the sense that, for example, many of, for example, Lyotard's position and his critique of this would be in the sense that to propose something is to leave something out, like in the structure of a law or something like this. A norm operates on a certain set of entities and so on. So you cannot really start from zero. The idea that is groundless is a fantasy or whatever. So the point is, even if you, for example, this is a good way, this is a discussion that's interesting because it helps, for example, to propose a critique of Breuer, who was a philosopher and a great mathematician. The guy made a connection between the interior of mathematics and the constitution of mathematicians. Says doing mathematics happens in this and that is a certain form of behavior. I want this to be transitive with what I accept within mathematics. I don't accept that there exists mental processes that are not finite or not active construction of something. Therefore, I don't want to accept within mathematics procedures which are not finite and not actually constructing what they prove, rather than simply constructing the negative proof, right? This is, let's say, the sort of strategy that tries to bind the ontological consistency, or however you want to call it, what happens within the space of a formalism with the conditions for the formalism to exist. And what I'm trying to say is that it's interesting because axioms and axiomatization brings very clearly to the fore the fact that even though this interiority is defined by propositions that have, let's say, material conditions, these material conditions are not informing, not grounding, determining what those propositions now do once they've been. The very fact that we shift our decision making, right? From the outside of mathematics, we say we will only accept things with this and that property. But then from the inside of mathematics, we say we will only accept things that actually enrich the space of operations. The decision over enriching, nobody can take, because even if you decide for an axiom based on the fact that it will enrich your formal space, it might not. So you will not be choosing that axiom because you thought it would. It's the mathematics itself that will say. So it's nice simply to see the shift in point of view between the point of view on that privileges the behaviors that condition the existence of mathematics to the point of view of mathematical thinking. And those two point of views don't really coincide. You can force them to coincide, and that's what you get in most rejections of, for example, the actual infinity. People cannot, there is no such behavior as thinking to infinity. There's only potentially going there. Therefore, I will only accept potential infinity. I will not accept actual infinity within our theory. It's trying to make it transitive, right? But the very fact that axioms show that there is a gap between these two regimes, these two domains, is a good way to go back to that discussion, for example, between love and art, where you have, of course, love motivating a path in art rather than another. In certain cases, it can be a constraint over this, but still, let's say, within art, you still get a different criteria, even if you motivated it externally. Yes. From this or that perspective.
Yeah, I would express that as saying that something can be a condition for other thing without constituting it.
Yeah, something like this. Yes.
So this is for instance the Fregean rejection of psychologism. I mean, yes, you think mathematical propositions, but mathematics is not just mental entities, just because you think them. So condition is not constitution.
Yeah, you don't ground just because there are things that have conditions. Yes. I think that, like, spelling out that in between domain, in properly spelling it out, in which sense something can be conditioned without being grounded, right? You can have a support that is not the determining instance. I think that that's a really interesting field to explore. You know, this idea of autonomization that I really like is everything to do with that. How can something be conditioning something else, but this something else extracts its laws of determination, not from the conditioning elements, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting issue of, let's say, morphogenesis, right?
Yes, but then again, maybe it's just a bias, like an unjustified bias. But then again, it's simply weird to, I mean, to have such non-naturalized entities. Like, okay, we put some inputs into a system, and the system starts behaving, and then we see that it follows a pattern, and then we judge that the pattern was already there, something like that. And the pattern is not physical in any sense. The pattern is not material in any sense. What the fuck is the pattern? So there you go. Then people get back into Platonism because of that. No, okay, the patterns are real. But you know, for something that is trying to solve the problem of the gap, it's okay. Maybe it's not false. Maybe Platonism in this sense is true, but it sounds easy, you know.
Yeah, but I think that everything hinges on what you mean by it was already there. Because why is that necessary? I mean, why is it that to recognize the legitimacy of that entity, you need to at the same time retroactively already ground it somehow?
Because it seems that it guided each and every step. So it seems like the rule was all formed and present there, you know. And the other way of explaining it is like an interactionist way, or some kind of resultant comes up, and you know, you get these results. But this is already what I'm aiming at. This is already naturalization. Okay.
But this is where I criticize Rothman today, and I think again you can go there, which is really the beauty of this thing. Like, there is no theory that defined actual infinity as a consistent, closed, legitimate, unproblematic object. At the same moment that it was accepted as an axiom, a series of new problems appeared. So let's say actual infinity for set theory is the set of open problems that follow from accepting actual infinity. Is not this rock you can rely on. And
I see.
You see my point? Like, it's almost delusion in the whole dialectics of problems. Like, actual infinity is the name of an infinity of problems that have been opened since then, and nobody has closed that door. Like, it really enriches the set of questions.
Okay, yeah, this
is way. So, like, the very idea that if you accept infinity, you're accepting an entity as real is weird, because I mean, it seems like it's even more true, because all the sort of weird problems we have with most entities of the world. Oh, did I really capture it? Is it really just this? Is there more structure to it than I think it is? All those problems apply to the problem of the infinite. Can I measure it? But if I measure it, what am I really measuring? What is the relation between what is beyond inaccessible and what is accessible, and so on? All of that applies to it, but at the same time, not in the ideal sense of something closed, fitting to its notion.
Who's this Rothman fellow that?
Oh, Reza, I really think you should read him, even though I think you will hate him so much. It's called Brian Rothman.
Oh, Brian Rothman. Okay.
He has a book called Ad Infinitum. Ad Infinitum, The Ghost in Turing's Machine.
I may have it.
I think I told you about it, yeah, as well. He takes, let's say, I like him because I think he makes the clearest possible case based on a kind of constructivist approach, itself based on a, let's say, very militant finitism of the body, of language, and so on, for why accepting actual infinity is to prevent the secularization of mathematics, because only God can count to infinity, things like this. So
yeah, I have the book. I think last time you told me I got the book,
I think it's a nice,
but I haven't gotten around to take a look at it.
It's worth taking a look, just because I think he places the argument in a very direct form. He's definitely not a moron. He says very interesting things, but I think he stages nicely the problem, you know. But at the same time, I think that there is always this, for example, as I was talking today with Caron in class, it's usually there is this slight distance from where the action is going on, because nobody said that you can count to infinity. Like, it's not a part of.
Yeah, that's not even the requirement.
Yeah, axiomatic set theory never says we can move from the finite to the infinite by adding to the finite. It says, if I suppose the infinite, I can do all this stuff. It's different. But so it would be also nice to see if there is such a contradiction with naturalism with this more what he calls inclusive imperative, right? Consider the infinity and now see what happens, rather
Have you read Fabio Gironi?
Naturalizing Badiou.
I haven't read it, but I was curious about it. Maybe
I
maybe it touches upon this problem. I don't know. I think it has to touch, because this is the main problem.
Yeah, he
Sorry?
Yeah.
Fabio what?
Gironi.
He writes on Badiou.
Naturalizing Badiou.
Yeah. I think that people are doing to Badiou what these guys and what the analytic tradition did to Hegel, kind of, let's keep all the good stuff and let's take out embarrassing stuff. Like, we want the Hegel of normative reason, sociality, and so on, and let's move away from the Hegel of spirit, crazy absolute idea, and so on. And now we're getting this sort of, let's stay with the Badiou of the generic, Badiou of multiplicity, and let's do away with the Badiou of, you know, infinity, this weird ontology, and Plato, and things like this.
I have to go, unfortunately. This is very...
No, this was great, guys. Thank you so much for, I mean, if I knew we would be staying for so long talking, I would have made a much more cohesive attempt at going step by step in the previous.
You covered a lot of ground.
Sorry?
You covered a lot of ground.
Yes, we did. But it was really helpful for me also to kind of sketch these things. I actually liked, I know it probably was just a bunch of weird hieroglyphs, but it was helpful for me also to kind of draw things out as we were talking, rather than just try to present it as a previously prepared thing. But it was really, really helpful.
Yeah, should we do a part 2 of this one, or are we already moving on?
I think we can move on. I mean, I don't have anything else prepared for next week.
So we have Reza next.
Reza, are you up for trying to present in 15 days?
I'm not sure. I will let you guys know because I had a hiccup in my research because of the paper I had to write. So
what about talking about? I mean, you could present the paper because I know it's very interesting. I want to talk about it with you. I mean, it's not that long. We could all read it and talk about it if you want.
well,
Like,
I'm hoping that talk happens in the next few days, because
no, okay, we can talk about it in the next few days, but it's still very interesting work anyway.
sure, I can talk about that paper.
Yeah, I mean, if you want, if you think you have the time to do something else, but just so you don't have the pressure, you know, of.
I don't think that I have time to, because like I said, it's been a while because of the priorities. I had to do this paper, and probably right after I have to go back to editing my manuscript, hopefully with Dennis. Dennis, you and I need to talk about this. So I probably will not have time for a while to get back to my research project, the one that you and I talked about a while back, working on which started working on the paper by Luca Fraser on intuitionism. So I think that if we want to present something in 15 days, that would be the Lazarou paper.
Oh shit, what is happening? I think that, I mean, if you're up for it, I think it would be really cool. But
sure. So let's agree on that. But I really appreciate your comments on the paper.
Yeah, I'll try to send you some comments, or at least if you're up for meeting and talking, perhaps it's easier in the next few days.
Sure.
Okay, we can talk about it.
Reading it and send you some comments, Rosa.
Sounds good.
Okay, guys, try to get some sleep now.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for the presentation.
Thank you.
See ya.
Bye, guys.